While I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from heart surgery, my daughter-in-law changed every lock on my house. Before I had even taken my first steps down the rehabilitation hallway, she had already told relatives, neighbors, and even a few old family friends that I would never be coming home. My own son believed every word she said without asking me a single question. By the time I finally reached for my phone, my home had already become someone else's story. My name is Thomas Walker. I'm 72 years old, and I spent more than 4 decades believing that if you built your life with honesty, your family would become the safest place you would ever know. I was wrong. Looking back now, I can still hear the steady rhythm of the heart monitor beside my bed, the soft footsteps of nurses moving through the hallway, and the pale morning light filtering through the hospital blinds. Recovery was supposed to be slow, peaceful, almost hopeful. Instead, it became the beginning of the most painful lesson of my life. "Mr. Walker," the nurse said with a warm smile as she adjusted the blanket across my legs, "your vitals look good this morning. Your family must be relieved." I smiled politely. I hope so. At that moment, I still believed they were simply busy. I still believed my son, Daniel, would walk through that door carrying one of those terrible cups of hospital coffee he always complained about. I imagined my granddaughter Emily teasing me for refusing to wear the hospital socks. I imagined laughter. I imagined home. Instead, the room stayed quiet. Hours passed. The television murmured in the corner without holding my attention. Every time footsteps stopped outside my room, I glanced toward the door, expecting a familiar face. Every time, it was someone else. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Relief washed over me until I saw it was only a text from Daniel. "Dad, just focus on getting better. Don't worry about anything at home." It sounded thoughtful enough, but something about those words settled heavily in my chest. Don't worry about anything at home. Why mention the house at all? I typed back, "Everything okay?" The three little dots appeared for a moment, then disappeared. No answer came. I set the phone down and stared through the window toward the parking garage below. The spring rain had left the sidewalk shining beneath the gray Tennessee sky. My late wife, Margaret, always loved rainy mornings. She used to say the world looked cleaner after a storm. 5 years had passed since cancer took her from me, but there were still mornings when I reached across the bed expecting to find her hand. That little brick house in Franklin was never just a building to us. Every room carried a memory. Every floorboard remembered our footsteps. Every tree in the backyard had been planted with our own hands. Losing Margaret had almost broken me. Losing that house never crossed my mind because I never imagined I would have to defend my right to walk through its front door. The next afternoon, my phone rang. The screen showed the name of my neighbor, George Bennett. George almost never called unless something truly mattered. "Thomas," he said before I could even greet him, his voice unusually tense. "Where are you?" "Still at Franklin Medical Center." "Why?" There was a pause. I could hear traffic somewhere behind him. "I wasn't sure anyone had told you." My heartbeat seemed louder than the machines surrounding me. "Told me what?" Another silence. Then George took a slow breath. "I watched a locksmith changing every lock on your house yesterday." My fingers tightened around the phone. "What?" "Front door, back door, garage, even the mailbox." The room suddenly felt much smaller. "There has to be some mistake." George answered quietly. "I wish there was." Before I could say another word, he continued. "Melissa was standing outside giving instructions. She told everyone watching that you weren't coming back." I couldn't speak. The air felt strangely thin. My chest tightened, not with pain from surgery, but with something colder, she said. George hesitated, as though he hated repeating the words. "She said you had decided to move into assisted living and the family was preparing the house." My voice barely came out. "I never said that." "I know you didn't." Another long silence settled between us. Finally, George spoke again. "Thomas, there was something else." I closed my eyes. "Go ahead." "Your son was there." I felt the words more than I heard them. Daniel, my only son, the little boy who used to ride on my shoulders at county fairs. The young man I helped move into his first apartment. The father whose mortgage I quietly helped pay after Emily was born. George continued carefully. He didn't say much. Mostly he stood there. Melissa did all the talking. I rested my head against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. Everything inside me wanted to believe there had been some terrible misunderstanding, some paperwork mix-up, some explanation that would make this nightmare disappear. Yet George had never lied to me in 30 years of friendship. "George," I finally whispered, "did anyone ask where I was?" "Yes." "And?" Melissa smiled. He paused again. She said, "Thomas isn't coming back." It's time everyone accepted that. My hand began to tremble. Not because I was afraid of losing a house, but because I suddenly realized someone had been writing the ending to my life while I was still fighting to recover. I thanked George quietly before ending the call. The room became silent again except for the steady beeping beside my bed. I reached toward the bedside drawer, where my wallet and house keys should have been waiting for me after discharge. My fingers stopped halfway. If George was telling the truth, those keys no longer opened anything. And deep inside me, another realization slowly surfaced. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure I would never discover the truth until it was too late. At that moment, I had no idea that the biggest lie wasn't about the locks. It was about why they had been changed in the first place. The rest of that afternoon passed in a strange silence that seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of my hospital room. I kept thinking about George's voice, not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. Some people only sound that serious when they have witnessed something they wish they had never seen. I had known George Bennett for almost 3 decades. We had painted our fences together, shoveled snow from each other's driveways, and spent countless Saturday mornings arguing over college football while drinking coffee on my back porch. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. Still, my mind refused to accept that everything had fallen apart in only a few days. The truth was much harder to admit. Things had not fallen apart overnight. They had been quietly cracking for years. I simply had not wanted to hear the sound. When my wife Margaret was still alive, she noticed small changes long before I did. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, she handed me a towel and said softly, "Thomas, promise me something." I smiled without looking up. "What is it?" "Do not confuse keeping the peace with ignoring the truth." I laughed then because I thought she was worrying too much. "Melissa is just outspoken," I replied. "She means well." Margaret dried another plate before answering. People who mean well usually do not leave others feeling smaller after every conversation. I remembered that exchange so clearly now that it almost hurt to breathe. Back then, Daniel had been happily married for only a few years. Emily was still a little girl who loved chasing fireflies across our backyard every summer evening. Melissa always arrived wearing a bright smile, carrying homemade desserts, calling me dad in front of everyone. Looking back, the warmth was always directed toward the room, never toward the people inside it. She had a remarkable talent for saying kind words while quietly moving everyone exactly where she wanted them. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. Family dinners moved from my dining room to theirs because, according to Melissa, it was easier for everyone. Holiday traditions changed because newer ideas were supposedly more practical. Birthdays became shorter visits. Sunday afternoons disappeared altogether. Every adjustment sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they slowly erased the life Margaret and I had built. One Thanksgiving, I offered to host dinner the way we always had. Melissa smiled politely across the kitchen island. "Thomas, you should relax this year. You have done enough cooking for a lifetime." Daniel nodded without even looking at me. "She is right, Dad. You deserve a break." I believed them. Instead of carving the turkey in my own kitchen, I arrived at their house carrying a pie. Margaret's recipe had taught me to bake. The pie stayed untouched on the counter while expensive catered desserts filled the table. No one mentioned it. I quietly carried it back home that evening. It sat in my refrigerator for nearly a week before I finally threw it away. The pie was not what hurt. It was realizing nobody had even noticed it was gone. After Margaret passed away, the distance became easier to hide because grief gives people convenient excuses. Daniel buried himself in work. Emily started high school. Melissa often called to ask whether I needed groceries or medication, and I appreciated the concern. What I did not notice was that every helpful question slowly turned into another conversation about my future. "Have you ever considered downsizing?" she asked one afternoon while pouring coffee into my favorite mug. "This house must feel awfully empty." I looked toward the backyard where Margaret's rose bushes were blooming. "Empty is not always a bad thing," I answered. "Sometimes it gives memories room to breathe." Melissa smiled in a way I could never quite understand. "Memories do not fix leaking roofs." A few weeks later, she brought it up again. "There are beautiful retirement communities nearby." Activities every day. New friends. Less maintenance. I chuckled gently. I already have friends. George still beats me at chess every Tuesday. She laughed politely, but there was disappointment hiding behind her eyes. Daniel rarely joined those conversations. If he did, he usually changed the subject. I told myself he was trying to avoid conflict. Now I wonder if he simply found it easier not to choose a side. Emily was different. She still visited whenever her college schedule allowed. She would sit on the porch swing beside me, watching squirrels race across the oak tree Margaret planted the year Daniel was born. "Grandpa," she once asked, "why do you never get rid of anything?" I smiled. "Because every old thing remembers somebody." She rested her head on my shoulder. "I hope this house never changes." Neither did I. Perhaps that was why it hurt so much to imagine strangers touching the doors, moving furniture, speaking about my future as though I had quietly disappeared. Late that evening, the nurse entered my room carrying another round of medication. She noticed I had barely touched my dinner. "Everything all right, Mr. Walker?" she asked. I forced a small smile. "I am beginning to think I missed more than a few days while I was lying here." She adjusted the blanket and said gently, "Sometimes the hardest recoveries are not the physical ones." After she left, I stared at the dark window beside my bed. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just more awake. Margaret had tried to warn me years earlier. George had finally shown me what I refused to see. Yet even then, one question continued circling through my mind. If Melissa had been planning this for so long, why had she seemed so certain that no one would ever challenge her? The following morning began with the quiet routines that hospitals seem to perform with almost sacred precision. A nurse checked my blood pressure, another adjusted my medication, and somewhere down the hallway a breakfast cart rattled across the polished floor. Life inside the building moved forward exactly as it should. Outside those walls, however, another life was quietly being rewritten without my permission. I kept turning one question over in my mind. If Melissa had been so confident, then confidence had to come from somewhere. People rarely gamble everything unless they believe the outcome has already been decided. Around mid-morning, my physician, Dr. Elaine Foster, stepped into my room carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. She smiled after looking over my chart. "Your recovery is progressing very well, Thomas. If everything continues like this, you should be discharged in a couple of days." "That is good news," I answered, though my voice carried none of the relief I expected to feel. She studied my face for a moment before asking, "Something is bothering you, isn't it?" I hesitated. "I am beginning to think I may have a difficult situation waiting for me at home." She nodded with the quiet understanding that only comes from years of caring for strangers during their hardest moments. "One step at a time," she said gently. "Do not make important decisions while you are still healing." After she left, I stared at the ceiling, remembering another conversation from nearly 2 years earlier. Melissa had visited my house carrying a folder tucked beneath her arm. "I found something that could really simplify your future," she had said cheerfully. She spread several pages across my dining room table. "You should transfer the house into Daniel's name now. It will save everyone trouble later." I glanced at the documents without touching them. "Why would I do that?" She answered as though the decision were obvious. "Because families should plan ahead. You trust Daniel, do not you?" I smiled. "Of course I trust my son." "Then this only makes sense." I folded the papers and handed them back across the table. "Planning ahead is important. Giving away my home while I am still living in it is something entirely different." For the first time that afternoon, the smile disappeared from her face. It lasted only a second before returning, but Margaret would have noticed it immediately. I remembered Melissa gathering the papers a little too quickly. "I was only trying to help." "I know," I replied, "but I already have my own plans in place." She tilted her head slightly. "What plans?" I simply smiled. "The kind that have served me well for 70 years. She did not ask another question, but I noticed something had changed. From that day forward, she never mentioned transferring ownership again. Instead, she began asking smaller questions. Where did I keep important documents? Which bank handled my accounts? Did I still have the original deed? They sounded harmless when separated by weeks or months. Looking back, they formed a careful pattern. I had answered almost none of them. Not because I suspected anything, but because Margaret and I had always believed that financial matters should remain private. That lesson came from our parents, and it had never failed us. My thoughts were interrupted when my telephone buzzed once more. This time the name on the screen belonged to Emily. I answered immediately. Grandpa? Her voice sounded strained. I have been trying to reach you since yesterday. I am here, sweetheart. She released a long breath. Nobody would tell me which room you were in. Mom kept saying you needed complete rest. The word mom caught my attention. Emily almost always called Melissa by her first name when we spoke privately. Is everything all right? I asked carefully. She hesitated long enough for me to hear her thinking. Grandpa, something feels wrong. I remained silent, allowing her to continue in her own time. I went by your house yesterday because I wanted to water Grandma's roses. My heart skipped. What happened? My key did not work. Another pause. Melissa came outside before I even knocked. She told me the house belonged to Dad now, and that nobody needed to come by anymore. I closed my eyes. What did your father say? He was inside, but he barely spoke. He looked uncomfortable. Emily's voice grew softer. Grandpa, I asked where your rocking chair had gone. You know, the one Grandma gave you for your 50th birthday. I swallowed hard. What did she tell you? She said old furniture had no place in their new plans. Those words settled over me more heavily than I expected. The chair itself was not valuable. It had scratches on the arms from decades of use, and one leg had been repaired twice. Yet Margaret had saved for months to surprise me with it. Every Christmas morning, every quiet evening after work, every conversation with Emily beneath the porch light had unfolded from that chair. Melissa had not merely dismissed an old piece of furniture. She had dismissed 40 years of memories without ever understanding what they meant. Emily spoke again. Grandpa, I do not think she knows everything. What do you mean? Yesterday, she kept asking Dad where your safe was. He said he did not know. I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Not relief, not satisfaction, simply clarity. Melissa believed there was something hidden inside my house that she had not yet found. She did not realize the most important things had never been kept there at all. I thanked Emily for calling and reminded her to stay kind, no matter how confusing things became. After we ended the conversation, I rested the phone on my lap and looked toward the bright afternoon sky beyond the hospital window. For the first time since George's call, fear began giving way to patience. Melissa thought she had taken control because she possessed a house. She had no idea that the one thing she truly wanted had been protected years before she ever started asking questions. And very soon she was going to discover that she had reached for something she never should have touched. Sleep came only in short stretches that night. Every time I closed my eyes, familiar places drifted through my memory with remarkable clarity. Margaret standing beneath the old maple tree trimming roses. Daniel learning to ride his bicycle along the cracked sidewalk in front of the house. Emily laughing from the porch swing while the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the yard. Those memories reminded me that a home is never measured by square footage or market value. It is measured by the people who leave pieces of themselves inside its walls. The following morning, just after sunrise, another visitor arrived. She was not family, and somehow that made me feel safer. The receptionist knocked gently before opening the door. Mr. Walker, she said, there is someone here asking for you. She says her name is Linda Harper. I smiled before I even saw her. Please send her in. Linda walked into the room carrying a leather briefcase that looked exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her calm expression carried the confidence of someone who had spent an entire career solving problems by reading every line that others ignored. She shook my hand warmly. Thomas, I wish we were meeting under happier circumstances. So do I answered. But I have a feeling you already know why I called. She pulled a chair beside my bed and placed the briefcase on her lap. George contacted my office yesterday afternoon. He said something unusual was happening at your property. I decided not to wait. I studied her face. You believed him that quickly? She gave a faint smile. George Bennett has never exaggerated anything in the 30 years I have known him. Her answer brought me a quiet sense of relief. Some friendships survive because they are built slowly, one ordinary day at a time. Linda opened her briefcase and carefully removed a thick folder secured with blue tabs. She rested one hand on the cover before speaking. Do you remember the afternoon you and Margaret came into my office after Daniel got married? I nodded immediately. Margaret had insisted on updating every legal document we owned. At the time, I thought we were simply being responsible. She had looked across Linda's desk and said something I never forgot. "Our son is a good man," Margaret said, "but good people sometimes make poor decisions when they trust the wrong voices." Linda looked at me now with the same thoughtful expression she wore that day. "Your wife was remarkably perceptive." I lowered my eyes toward the folder. "She usually was." Linda unclipped the binder and turned several pages with practiced precision. "Thomas, everything you and Margaret established is still fully intact. Your trust remains active. The property ownership has never changed. The medical directives are exactly as you instructed. No one has authority to transfer your home simply because you entered a hospital." I released a breath I had not realized I was holding. "Then why would anyone behave as though they already owned it?" Linda answered without hesitation. "Because confidence and legal authority are not the same thing." The room grew quiet. Outside my window, morning sunlight spread across the parking lot, warming the tops of parked cars. Linda continued reading through the documents before stopping on one particular page. "There is something else." I looked up. "What is it?" She slid the page toward me. "Margaret insisted that one provision remain confidential unless circumstances required otherwise." Even after all these years, hearing my wife's name spoken with such respect stirred something deep inside me. "I remember signing a great deal of paperwork," I admitted. "I do not remember every detail." Linda smiled gently. "That was intentional. Margaret believed that the fewer people discussed these protections, the stronger they would remain." She tapped the page lightly with one finger. "The trust includes a succession clause that cannot be activated by assumptions, verbal statements, or family pressure. It only changes under very specific legal conditions, none of which have occurred." I looked at the document, then back at Linda. "So nothing has changed." "Correct. Not even while I have been here? Especially not while you have been here." Her certainty settled over the room like steady ground beneath uncertain feet. She closed the folder before saying something that made me sit a little straighter despite the soreness in my chest. "Thomas, whoever has been acting without understanding these documents has made a very serious mistake." I remained silent. Linda continued, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "They assumed the house was the most valuable thing you possessed. They never realized the real protection was created years ago." A soft knock interrupted us. George stepped into the room, carrying a paper bag from my favorite local bakery. "I figured hospital food could use some competition," he joked before noticing Linda. "Good morning." Linda stood and shook his hand. "George, thank you for calling me when you did." He looked confused. "I only did what any neighbor should do." Linda smiled. "Most people would have stayed out of it." George glanced toward me. "Not after everything you and Margaret did for our neighborhood." His words filled the room with memories that no legal document could ever contain. Linda gathered her papers and returned them to the briefcase. Before leaving, she paused beside my bed. "Thomas, I have practiced law for more than 35 years. I have watched families disagree over property, money, and pride. But every now and then someone makes an error so complete that it becomes impossible to hide. I believe you are about to witness one of those moments." She rested a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Do not rush home. Let the truth arrive before you do." As she walked toward the door, I noticed a faint smile that had not been there when she entered. For the first time since my surgery, I realized I was no longer reacting to events. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, people believed they were already celebrating a victory. They had no idea that the person they had underestimated was not me. It was the woman who had quietly prepared for this day years before any of us imagined it would ever come. The day after Linda visited, something inside me became remarkably still. Not because the situation had improved, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced by understanding. Fear grows best in darkness. Once even a small light appears, it begins to lose its strength. I spent most of the morning sitting beside the hospital window, watching clouds drift slowly above the rolling Tennessee hills. Margaret used to tell me that patience was not the ability to wait. It was the ability to remain yourself while waiting. Those words stayed with me as another knock sounded on my hospital door. This time it was not a nurse or a doctor. It was a familiar face from many years ago. "Thomas Walker," the man said with a broad smile. "I heard you were trying to escape before finishing physical therapy." I laughed for the first time in several days. "Frank Donovan, I cannot believe you are still telling the same jokes." Frank had retired from the Franklin Police Department several years earlier. Before that, We had worked together on several community improvement projects. He had always been the sort of man people trusted without ever needing to explain why. He shook my hand firmly before taking the chair beside my bed. "George called me," he admitted. "He said things looked unusual. That is one way to describe them." Frank studied me carefully. "How are you holding up?" I looked out the window for a moment before answering. "I have lived long enough to know that disappointment passes. Betrayal takes a little longer." Frank nodded quietly. "That sounds like something Margaret would have said." We shared a brief silence. Then he leaned forward. "Thomas, there is something you should know. People around town have started talking." I frowned. "About what?" "Different versions of the same story." He folded his hands together. "Some say you decided to leave voluntarily. Others believe you sold your house. A few even think you moved away before anyone noticed." I smiled faintly. Interesting how quickly stories grow when the truth stays quiet. Frank smiled back. "Exactly." He hesitated before adding, "Not everyone believes those stories." "Why?" He looked directly into my eyes. "Because people remember who you are." His words settled over me more deeply than he probably realized. For years, I had rarely thought about my own reputation. I simply lived my life. I repaired fences for neighbors after storms. I volunteered with the local veterans charity, even though I had never spoken much about my own years of military service in the Army Corps of Engineers. I quietly funded scholarships at the community college in Margaret's name after she passed away. I never announced any of it. Margaret believed kindness worked best when nobody was counting. Frank seemed to read my thoughts. "You know why people called me?" I shook my head. "Because they could not believe the Thomas Walker they knew would simply disappear without saying goodbye." I lowered my eyes toward my hands. My fingers looked older than I remembered, marked by decades of work, weather, and ordinary life. "I never wanted recognition," I said softly. "I know." Frank smiled. "That is exactly why you earned it." Before I could answer, my telephone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously, "This is Thomas Walker." A polite female voice replied, "Mr. Walker, my name is Rebecca Sloan. I am the director of the Franklin Community Heritage Foundation. I hope I am not disturbing you." I glanced toward Frank with curiosity. "Not at all. I recently heard that you were recovering from surgery. We wanted to check on you." "That is very kind." She continued, "Our board also became aware of certain rumors regarding your residence. We simply wanted you to know that if you require documentation concerning the restoration grants you managed or your historical preservation agreements, we have complete records." I exchanged another surprised look with Frank. "You still have those files?" She almost laughed. "Mr. Walker, half the restored homes in the historic district still carry your recommendations in their records." Of course we kept them. After we ended the call, Frank leaned back in his chair with an amused expression. "You really have no idea how many people remember your work, do you?" I shrugged gently. "I only did what needed doing." "Exactly." Later that afternoon, Linda returned carrying another folder. She placed several papers on the bedside table beside me. "These are copies only," she explained. "The originals remain secured where they have always been." I nodded. "Good." She looked toward Frank before turning back to me. "Thomas, I spoke with the county recorder's office this morning. And? No ownership changes have been filed. No authorized transfers exist. Everything remains exactly as Margaret intended." Frank smiled quietly. "Then someone has been making plans without checking the facts." Linda closed the folder. "More than that." She looked directly at me. "Someone assumed that your strength came from a building." She paused just long enough for her next words to settle into the silence. "They failed to understand that your strength has always come from the life you built inside your community." I found myself thinking about all the ordinary moments Margaret and I had shared over 46 years of marriage. None of them had seemed extraordinary at the time. Yet somehow those simple acts of consistency had become something far more valuable than either of us realized. Reputation cannot be purchased. Trust cannot be inherited. Respect cannot be demanded. They arrive one quiet day at a time, until people begin protecting your name even when you are not present to defend it yourself. As evening settled outside my hospital window, another message arrived on my phone. It came from Emily. "Grandpa, something happened today." Mom looked inside the old filing cabinet again. She seemed frustrated because she still could not find what she was looking for. I read the message twice before setting the phone down. Melissa was still searching. She believed one missing document would finally complete her plan. What she did not know was that the document she wanted had never been hidden inside my house. It had been protected years earlier by the one person she had underestimated from the very beginning, and before long she was going to discover that she had been chasing the wrong prize all along. The second morning after Linda's visit began with a quiet confidence I had not felt since arriving at the hospital. My body was still healing, but my mind no longer wandered through endless questions. Facts have a way of calming fear. I knew where I stood. I knew what Margaret and I had prepared years ago. Most importantly, I knew that truth did not become weaker simply because someone spoke louder than it. Shortly after breakfast, Linda returned carrying her familiar leather briefcase, but this time there was a different expression on her face. It was not concern. It was purpose. She closed the door gently behind her before taking a seat beside my bed. "Thomas," she said, "I have already spoken with the county recorder, your financial institution, and the title office. Every record confirms exactly what we expected." I nodded quietly. Nothing changed. Nothing could have changed. She placed several certified copies on the bedside table. "There is no transfer. There is no authorization. There is no legal document giving anyone permission to exclude you from your own property." I looked at the papers without touching them. They represented years of careful planning, yet they felt almost secondary now. "I never wanted this to become a legal matter," I admitted. Linda smiled gently. "Most honest people never do. They simply hope everyone else will also act honestly." Before I could answer, George stepped into the room with an uneasy expression. "I thought you both should know," he said. "There are 2 moving trucks parked outside your house this morning." My eyes met Linda's. She did not look surprised. She simply opened her briefcase again and removed her telephone. "Would you excuse me for a few minutes?" she asked. She stepped into the hallway, speaking calmly with someone I could not hear. Her voice never rose. She never sounded angry. When she returned several minutes later, she quietly placed the phone back into her bag. "The appropriate people have been notified," she said. "Now we wait." George frowned. "That is it?" Linda looked toward him with remarkable composure. Justice usually begins with patience, not panic. Hours passed slowly. The afternoon sunlight drifted across the hospital floor while nurses came and went, each carrying on with ordinary routines, completely unaware that my entire future seemed suspended somewhere beyond those walls. Near 3 o'clock, my phone vibrated. It was Emily. I answered immediately. "Hello, sweetheart." Her voice was shaking. "Grandpa, there are police officers outside the house." I remained completely still. "Tell me what you see." 2 patrol cars just pulled into the driveway. Mom rushed outside before they even reached the porch. I closed my eyes, listening carefully. In the background, I could hear muffled voices carried by the wind. Emily whispered, "She keeps pointing toward the house." "Stay where you are," I said calmly. "Do not interrupt anyone." "I will." Another pause followed. Then she whispered again. "Dad just came outside too. He looks confused." Several seconds passed before she continued. "One of the officers asked something." I could not hear the whole sentence. "Did you hear any of it?" "Only the last part." "What was it?" Emily took a slow breath. He asked, "Can you show us the legal authority that allows you to deny the homeowner access to this property?" The room became very quiet. George slowly lowered his coffee cup onto the windowsill. Linda folded her hands together without saying a word. I felt neither satisfaction nor anger, only sadness. I imagined Daniel standing there, caught between his wife and the reality unfolding in front of him. I imagined Melissa searching for an answer that did not exist. Emily spoke again. "Mom is saying Grandpa gave them permission." Linda leaned toward my phone and spoke gently enough for only Emily to hear. "Did the officer ask for written authorization?" "Yes." "And?" "Mom keeps saying it was a family decision." Linda thanked her quietly before handing the phone back to me. Emily's voice had become softer. "Grandpa, the officers are not arguing with anyone. They are just asking the same questions over and over." I smiled faintly. "Good officers usually do." She sounded puzzled. "Why?" "Because facts do not become clearer by raising your voice." Several minutes later, another call arrived, this time from Officer Jacob Ramirez. His tone was professional and respectful. "Mr. Walker?" "Yes." "I understand you are currently hospitalized." "That is correct." "Would you mind confirming whether you instructed anyone to prevent your own access to your residence?" "No, officer." I did not. Did you authorize anyone to represent that you would not be returning home? No. A brief silence followed while he noted my answers. Thank you. That is all I needed for the moment. Officer? Yes, sir? Please remember my son may have believed what he was told. I would appreciate everyone being treated with respect while the facts are sorted out. There was another pause before he answered. I understand, Mr. Walker. That is exactly what we intend to do. After the call ended, George looked at me with disbelief. Most people would be furious. I rested my hands quietly across the hospital blanket. Anger would not change the truth. Linda nodded with quiet approval. And truth does not require anger to stand on its own. As evening settled over Franklin, I watched the fading sunlight paint long shadows across the hospital parking lot. Somewhere across town, conversations were changing. Assumptions were giving way to questions. Confidence was being replaced by uncertainty. Nobody had been shouted down. Nobody had been threatened. The only thing that had entered the story was the truth, spoken calmly and supported by facts. For the first time since all of this began, I realized the tide had already turned. The people who believed they were in complete control were no longer deciding what happened next. They were being asked to explain decisions that could no longer be hidden behind confident words alone. The following morning, the hospital seemed quieter than it had been since my surgery. Perhaps nothing had changed except my own perspective. There comes a point when uncertainty no longer controls a person because the truth has begun doing its work. I no longer wondered whether the facts would matter. I only wondered how long it would take before everyone else accepted them. Just after 9 o'clock, my telephone rang again. This time, it was Daniel. For several seconds, I simply looked at his name on the screen before answering. Good morning, son. His voice sounded exhausted. Dad, can we talk? Of course. A long silence settled between us. Finally, he spoke again. Things have become complicated. I closed my eyes for a moment. Tell me what happened. He sighed heavily. After the officers left yesterday, Melissa insisted they misunderstood everything. She said they were overreacting. I listened without interrupting. Then Linda arrived at the house with copies of the property records. His voice grew quieter. She did not argue. She simply handed the officers the documents. And everything Melissa had been saying suddenly stopped making sense. I could almost picture Daniel standing in the living room, struggling to connect the woman he loved with the facts now placed in front of him. Dad, he whispered. I asked her why she never told me about any of this. What did she say? Another pause. First, she blamed George. She said he was interfering in family business. Then, when that did not work, she said Linda had always disliked her. I remained silent. Daniel continued. After that, she said you must have changed everything without telling anyone. I spoke gently. Did she offer any evidence? No. Only explanations? Yes. I nodded even though he could not see me. Truth usually requires evidence. Fear usually requires excuses. Daniel did not answer immediately. I could hear him breathing. Finally, he admitted, I have never heard you say anything like that before, because I never expected to need to. Before we ended the call, he said something that stayed with me for the rest of the day. Dad, I think I have been listening to one voice for too many years. After the conversation ended, Linda arrived carrying only a slim folder instead of her usual briefcase. She smiled softly as she entered. I thought you might appreciate an update. Please. She took the chair beside my bed. Yesterday became very interesting after Officer Ramirez finished reviewing the records. I waited quietly. Melissa attempted to explain that everyone had simply misunderstood her intentions. Did anyone argue with her? Linda shook her head. No. That is what unsettled her the most. She smiled faintly. The officers kept asking the same simple questions. Who owns the property? Who authorized the lock changes? Where is the written permission? And there were no satisfactory answers. George joined us a few minutes later carrying fresh coffee. You should have seen the neighbors, he said with a chuckle. Yesterday, everyone stood on their porches pretending to water flowers. Even I laughed. George continued, funny thing about small towns. They notice everything. Linda smiled knowingly, especially when people begin telling different versions of the same story. George nodded. That is exactly what happened. Melissa kept saying she was protecting the family. Daniel looked completely confused. Then the neighbors started comparing what each of them had been told over the past week. Different stories? I asked. Different enough. George leaned back in his chair. One family had been told you requested privacy. Another was told you had permanently relocated. Someone else heard you planned to sell the house months ago. He shrugged. People began realizing none of those stories matched. Linda folded her hands together. False stories rarely collapse because someone attacks them. They collapse because they cannot remain consistent. Later that afternoon, Emily called. This time, there was a trace of hope in her voice. Grandpa? Hello, sweetheart. Dad asked me something today. What was that? He asked whether Grandma ever talked to me about the house. I smiled sadly. And what did you tell him? I told him Grandma always said a family should protect each other before protecting property. I closed my eyes as Margaret's words echoed through my memory once again. Emily continued, Dad cried. Those two words filled the silence between us. I had not heard of my son crying since the day we buried his mother. He kept saying, How did I miss all of this? Emily whispered, Grandpa, I do not think he understands how things reached this point. Sometimes, I answered quietly, people only recognize a slow change after it finally stops. That evening, George received another call from one of our neighbors and stopped by the hospital before returning home. You will appreciate this, he said. Apparently, Melissa and Daniel argued for nearly an hour after everyone left. I looked at him but said nothing. Nobody heard every word. Of course, George continued. But several people heard enough. Enough to know what? Melissa kept insisting that everything she did was for the family's future. He paused. Daniel finally asked her one simple question. What was it? George looked directly at me. If this was really for our family, why did you never tell me the whole truth from the beginning? The room fell quiet. Linda smiled gently but said nothing. There was nothing left to add. No accusation could have carried more weight than that single question. It had not come from a police officer. It had not come from a lawyer. It had come from the one person whose trust mattered most to her. As darkness settled beyond the hospital window, I realized I had done almost nothing since this ordeal began except answer questions honestly whenever they were asked. The arguments, the contradictions, the shifting explanations, and the growing distrust had all appeared without my help. Truth has an unusual quality. Once it enters a room, people who built their confidence on half-truths often begin pulling apart their own stories. Watching it happen was not satisfying. It was heartbreaking. Families are not usually destroyed by a single lie. They are slowly worn down by the effort required to protect it. And somewhere across town, that effort had finally become too heavy for everyone carrying it. Nearly a week after my surgery, the doctor finally smiled as he reviewed my chart. Thomas, he said, closing the folder with a quiet nod. I believe you are ready to go home tomorrow, provided you promise me one thing. I smiled back. What is that? Recover at the same pace your heart wants to recover, not at the pace your pride suggests. I laughed softly because Margaret used to say almost the same thing. There are moments in life when two completely different people somehow arrive at the exact same wisdom. As the doctor left, I remained seated beside the window instead of climbing back into bed. The late afternoon sun stretched across the hills beyond Franklin, turning everything gold for a few brief minutes before evening settled in. I realized something unexpected. I was no longer thinking about winning. Somewhere along the way, the desire to prove myself had quietly disappeared. I simply wanted to go home, breathe the familiar air beneath the maple tree Margaret planted, and begin living again. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked into my hospital room alone. He looked older than he had only a week earlier. Not because time had passed, but because truth has a way of adding years to a person's face when it finally asks to be acknowledged. He stopped a few feet from my bed, unsure whether to come closer. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he lowered his eyes. Dad, I do not know where to begin. I looked toward the empty chair beside the window. Sit down. He obeyed quietly. His hands remained folded together as though he were trying to keep them from shaking. I should have asked more questions. I nodded but said nothing. I should have called you. Another silence followed. I should have trusted you enough to hear your side before believing anyone else's. His voice broke on the final sentence. I had imagined this conversation many times over the past several days, but now that it had arrived, I found I carried no rehearsed speech inside me. Daniel, I said quietly, every family reaches moments where someone has to decide whether being right matters more than remaining honest. He looked up. I failed that test. You made a mistake. I paused before continuing. Do not let that mistake become your identity. Tears filled his eyes. Can you ever forgive me? I thought about Margaret again. She often said forgiveness was not pretending something never happened. It was refusing to allow pain to become the only story worth telling. Yes, I answered, because I would rather have my son back than spend the rest of my life proving I was right. Daniel covered his face with both hands. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Sometimes silence carries more healing than perfect words ever could. Before leaving, he looked at me again. Emily wants to help get the house ready before you come home. I smiled. Tell her I would like that very much. After he left, Emily arrived carrying a small paper bag. I brought something, she said with the bright smile I had missed so much. She reached inside the bag and carefully removed a tiny glass jar. Inside were several rose blossoms floating in water. I clipped these from Grandma's garden this morning. My throat tightened. You remembered which ones she loved. Emily nodded. I could never forget. She placed the jar on the windowsill where the evening light passed gently through the petals. The bushes needed trimming anyway, she said. I thought she would like knowing they were still blooming. We sat together quietly for a while, watching the sunlight fade. Then she asked the question I knew had been resting inside her heart. Grandpa, are you angry? I considered the question carefully before answering. I was hurt. She nodded. That is different. Very different. She leaned her head against my shoulder exactly as she had done when she was 10 years old. I do not want our family to stay broken forever. I rested my hand gently over hers. Neither do I. Is that possible? She whispered. I smiled sadly. Families do not heal because someone forgets what happened. They heal when enough people decide that truth deserves a permanent place at the table. She thought about that for a long moment before smiling. Grandma would have liked that answer. She probably would have improved it, I replied, and we both laughed. The next morning, George arrived carrying my overnight bag. Ready to escape? He asked. More than ready. He helped me gather my few belongings while speaking about ordinary things. The weather, the high school football schedule, the bakery downtown reopening after renovations. I appreciated every simple conversation because ordinary life had begun to feel like a gift again. Before we left the hospital, I stopped in the chapel for a few quiet minutes. It was empty except for soft light filtering through stained glass windows. I sat alone, thinking not about the house, the legal papers, or the misunderstandings that had filled the past week. Instead, I thought about Margaret, about the countless evenings we spent laughing over burnt dinners, unexpected rainstorms, and the ordinary little moments that eventually become a lifetime. I realized then that my greatest inheritance had never been the house at all. It was the character she helped build inside me over 46 years of marriage. That was something no lock could ever keep me away from, and no misunderstanding could ever take from me. As George and I walked toward the hospital entrance, he glanced over and smiled. You seem lighter. I looked out at the bright Tennessee sky waiting beyond the sliding glass doors, because I finally remembered what matters most. What is that? I smiled as we stepped into the fresh morning air. A peaceful heart is worth far more than winning an argument. Houses can be repaired. Reputations can recover. Even broken families sometimes find their way home, but only if someone is willing to choose grace before pride. As we drove slowly through the familiar streets toward Franklin, I noticed the maple trees lining the roads had begun showing the first hints of new leaves. Spring had quietly arrived while I was learning one of the hardest lessons of my life. Sometimes the richest legacy we leave behind is not the property we own or the money we save. It is teaching the people we love that kindness, honesty, and forgiveness will always outlast fear. And for the first time since all of this began, I believed that legacy still had a future. 3 weeks after I returned home, life finally began to sound like itself again. The mornings were quiet except for birds settling into the maple tree outside the kitchen window. The old wooden floors greeted me with the same familiar creaks they had made for decades. Margaret used to joke that the house spoke its own language. Standing there with a warm cup of coffee in my hands, I realized she had been right all along. Home had been waiting for me just as faithfully as I had been trying to find my way back to it. The new locks fit smoothly into the front door, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because every family eventually learns that healthy boundaries are not walls built against love. They are doors that only open through trust. Daniel visited almost every Saturday after that. At first, our conversations were careful, almost fragile, like two people learning to walk across an old bridge that had finally been repaired. Neither of us pretended the past week had never happened. Instead, we allowed honesty to replace silence one conversation at a time. One afternoon, we sat together on the back porch watching sunlight drift through Margaret's rose garden. He looked toward the flowers for a long time before speaking. "Dad, I spent years believing that avoiding conflict meant protecting my family." I nodded quietly. "Many people believe that." He lowered his eyes. "Now I understand that avoiding the truth only gave confusion more room to grow." I rested my hand on his shoulder, recognizing that is the beginning of wisdom, not the end of failure. He smiled through tired eyes. "I still have a great deal to repair." "So do all of us," I answered. "That is why tomorrow exists." Emily became an even brighter part of my daily life. Every Wednesday, after her college classes, she stopped by with groceries, fresh flowers, or simply another story about campus. Sometimes we worked together in Margaret's garden. Sometimes we sat quietly on the porch swing without saying much at all. She once looked across the yard and asked, "Grandpa, what do you think Grandma would say if she could see all of us now?" I smiled toward the roses gently moving in the breeze. She would probably remind us that families become stronger when they choose humility before pride. Emily laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like her." As for Melissa, life quietly moved in a different direction. There were no dramatic confrontations and no desire for revenge. Decisions simply carried their natural consequences. Trust that had once been freely given had to be earned again, and some relationships became more distant as everyone took time to reflect on what had happened. I wished her no harm. Carrying resentment would only have kept me tied to one of the hardest chapters of my life. Letting go did not mean forgetting. It meant refusing to allow bitterness to become my permanent address. Linda visited one afternoon with nothing more than a pie from the bakery downtown. We shared coffee at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had signed so many birthday cards, balanced checkbooks, and planned ordinary weekends that eventually became treasured memories. Linda smiled as she looked around the room. "Your wife would be pleased." I looked toward the family photograph still hanging on the wall. "She prepared me better than I ever realized." Linda nodded. "She protected more than your home." I understood exactly what she meant. Margaret had spent a lifetime teaching me that character quietly outlives conflict, that patience often accomplishes more than anger, and that truth rarely needs to shout because time eventually speaks for it. Several months later, our neighborhood held its annual community picnic in the park. Families gathered beneath large oak trees, while children chased one another across the grass. George insisted we sit together on the same old bench we had shared every year. As people stopped to say hello, I noticed something that touched me deeply. No one spoke about the conflict anymore. They asked about my recovery. They admired Margaret's roses. They congratulated Emily on college. They laughed with Daniel as though hope had slowly returned to our family. Life had continued, not because the pain had seemed 7, but because kindness had quietly proven stronger than it. If you have listened to my story this far, perhaps you have carried a burden that feels strangely familiar. Maybe someone misunderstood your intentions. Maybe your kindness was mistaken for weakness. Maybe you have spent years believing your worth depended on someone else's opinion. I hope you remember something I nearly forgot myself. Your value is never determined by the loudest voice in the room. It is revealed by the quiet consistency with which you choose honesty, dignity, and compassion, even when those qualities are not immediately rewarded. Protect your peace without apologizing for it. Protect your heart without hardening it. Protect your future with wisdom, but never allow fear to become the architect of your life. There is great strength in remaining gentle without becoming vulnerable to manipulation, and there is even greater strength in refusing to lose yourself while trying to keep everyone else happy. If this story has reminded you of someone you love, or perhaps even of yourself, I hope it leaves you with the quiet confidence to value truth, healthy boundaries, and the people who stand beside you when life becomes difficult. Thank you for spending these moments with me and allowing this chapter of my life to become part of yours. Knowing that someone, somewhere, took the time to listen makes this journey feel a little less lonely and a little more meaningful than I ever expected. Until our paths cross again in another story, take good care of your heart, cherish the people who earn your trust, and never forget that the strongest homes are not built with locks or walls, but with love that is guided by truth. Before I went inside that evening, I stopped beside Margaret's favorite rose bush and gently settled into the old rocking chair she had given me decades earlier. The woods still carried the faint marks of countless evenings spent together watching the sun disappear behind the trees. As the porch grew quiet and the first stars appeared above the Tennessee sky, I finally understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. A house can shelter your body, but only truth, love, and self-respect can truly bring you home.